Good evening, everybody. My name is Ian McFarland, and thank you for joining the Animal Health Update webinar. Today's webinar is possible due to the funding from Australian Wool Innovation and the South Australian Sheep Industry Fund. And more information on the program, Sheep Connect SA, can be found at our website or via Twitter. We have a number of upcoming events, so we've got 2 more webinars coming up on the 11th of September and the 4th of October. So look out for the registration on the Sheep Connect website on the events page. And we've also got a Ramping Up Repro workshop coming up in the southeast if you're interested. So today's presenter is Chris Van-Dissel. Chris is a Senior Animal Health Officer with PIRSA. He's been on the job for about 18 years and is currently based at Nuruyukta. And so I will now pass it over to Chris to talk about animal health.
Yes, thank you, Ian. Thanks for the introduction. Tonight I'm going to talk about some of our endemic disease control programs for sheep in South Australia and some of the recent changes we've had with those programs, as well as giving you all a bit of an introduction to each of the diseases that we cover tonight. There's a bit to get through, so I'm not going to go into too much specific detail, but I'll try to provide some introduction for each disease. So first we're going to talk about Johne's disease, ovine Johne's disease in sheep. So Johne's disease been around in Australia sort of since the late 80s, early 90s. It's a wasting disease of sheep. It affects other species as well, including cattle, goats, deer and camelids, alpacas. The causative bacteria is Mycobacterium paratuberculosis. It tends to invade the animal's intestine, the small intestine mainly. OJD causes a thickening of the intestinal wall in sheep, and what that does is block the absorption of nutrients and food. So the sheep is hungry and it eats and grazes a lot, but it doesn't absorb any nutrients, and so it doesn't put on any condition and eventually wastes away and dies. So here, this is the ileum, the first section of the small intestine in a sheep, and that is in a Johne's affected animal. You can see it's quite thick. Ileum should look like sausage casing. It should be very thin and opaque. You should be able to see through it. You can see here that this one's quite thick. And if you look at the cross section there, that one's been sliced longitudinally. If you look here, you've got a good couple of mils thickness there. It's certainly not thin like sausage casing, and that's the inflammation caused by the Johne's bacteria, which is then subsequently affecting that animal's ability to absorb nutrients. So the OJD bacteria, everything it does slowly, but has a very small infective dose. So you don't need very much actual bacteria to cause disease in an animal. It doesn't have to ingest very much bacteria. But an infected animal sheds a huge amount of bacteria in its feces. So consequently, you don't need very many infected animals to enter a mob of sheep to expose the whole mob to disease. And the other thing with that bacteria is it lasts a very long time on the ground. So whilst Johne's disease in animals tends to take a long time to develop into clinical disease and takes a while to kill them, it also takes a very long time to die in the environment. So unlike other things like Footrot that we'll talk about later, it survives for very long periods in the right conditions. And the conditions that most bacteria like are sort of moist conditions, so favours wetter areas. So the symptoms of OJD, you see this animal here is basically wasting away to nothing. It's probably only a few days off of dying, and it's just not able to put any condition on at all. Where you get very high excretion rates on pastures and a big load of bacteria, you can get sporadic deaths, particularly of young stock that ingest a really high infective dose of bacteria, but that is certainly not as common as the wasting away into adult life. And then diarrhea in a small proportion. Unlike bovine Johne's disease, ovine Johne's is not always associated with scouring and diarrhea. So we've had a pretty long established control program for OJD in South Australia. It's been a notifiable disease and a disease where we've detected it, properties have had orders placed on them and undertake a management program to get rid of the disease. And probably the last state that kept a state-run program going, and that's currently changing. So the change is a change of focus from government regulation to buyer beware. Buyer beware gets banded around a bit, but what it means is that rather than relying on people to ensure that sheep with disease aren't being traded or aren't entering the state, they will now be able to trade, and so you need to make sure that you're requesting sheep health statements and asking the right questions when you buy sheep to, if you don't want to buy sheep with disease, make sure that you don't buy them onto your property. So about a year ago, Johne's disease went from a notifiable disease to a notifiable report only disease. That meant if you detect it or you suspect that, you still need to notify the department or a veterinary officer, but basically that's where it ended. We ceased having compulsory inspections of adult sheep at the TFI abattoir at Livestock, and so those inspections now only occur when producers request them. We ceased having automatic property quarantines for detection of disease. So if we did pick it up, either through a trace or an investigation or an abattoir detection, properties were no longer placed under a quarantine order. And the amount of on-farm control and testing that we could assist with was reduced. As well as the Gudair, Gudair is the OJD vaccine. Previously, the government subsidised that through the Sheep Industry Fund for producers who became affected with disease or are at risk. That subsidy was removed a bit over 12 months ago. There's no longer any tracing or testing of traces or notification to neighbours if disease is detected. So that means if we do pick up infected properties now, we don't look at their sales history or what they brought onto their property, and we no longer notify the neighbours that disease has been found. So it's gone to basically an industry managed disease. The changes that occurred this year that have been in the media this year relate to the removal of interstate movement restrictions. Previously, because we ran a pretty vigorous disease control program and our neighbouring states were not, we had restrictions on sheep coming in to the state, so that we made sure that sheep that did come in were up to the same standard as South Australian sheep. Those restrictions have now been removed. And in a nutshell, what that means is that sheep from outside of the state don't have to test negative for Johne's to get in anymore, or be from a regional biosecurity plan area, and they don't have to be approved vaccinates as they did up until July this year. The things they still do require, and these are the things that we possibly need to pay more attention to now, are the NLIS tag, as all sheep that move need, a completed movement document, which is an NVD or something that has the same information as an NVD, and a completed National Sheep Health Declaration, and that must accompany the sheep into South Australia. So that whilst they can come in regardless of status, they need to be declaring what they have, particularly on the Sheep Health Declaration, so that as purchasers, you know what you're getting. And the movement document, NVD, and sheep health statement must be provided to anyone who receives sheep from interstate. That can be via an NLIS database upload if those documents are scanned and transferred over to your property identification code. But they've also got to be with the animals as they come across our borders. And one thing I suppose to be wary of there is that South Australia is still the only state that has compulsory sheep health declaration for all movements. And so if you're buying interstate, you need to make sure that the vendors are aware that that's a requirement, and they'll need to fill one out for you accurately and completely for those sheep that are coming in. And as PIRSA, the South Australian Department, don't have records on sheep from interstate, our recommendation is that you try and buy them either vaccinated previously with Gudair vaccine or vaccinate them when they come onto your property, because unless they've had some sort of testing, status is unknown and they could well be carrying disease. Just talk a bit about Gudair vaccine. Gudair is the OJD vaccine, as I said before, and it's important to understand what an approved vaccinate is when we're talking about Gudair vaccine. So an approved vaccinate is an animal that's been vaccinated between 4 and 16 weeks of age. So the aim there is that they get protection from Johne's disease before they start grazing and have the ability to ingest the bacteria from pasture, or they're vaccinated after they've had a negative test for Johne's disease. So they've basically proved they haven't got disease at the point of vaccination, which from there has a good chance of protecting them. Those animals will have a V in the tag. Used to have a circle, it doesn't now have to have a circle, so long as there's a V in the tag, that will indicate an approved vaccinate, and there's a place to declare that approved vaccinate status on the Sheep Health Declaration. So yeah, do look for those V's in the tag. It will indicate that they've had that Gudair vaccine. It's relatively important that animals that have had that Gudair vaccination, one shot for life, don't get jabbed again. What we do find though is that obviously Gudair vaccine is used more widely in areas of higher prevalence for OJD. So buying vaccinates, approved vaccinates, is not the be all and end all, because you may well be targeting sheep from areas of higher prevalence. So again, it's important to, if you're concerned, to request testing information, be that pooled fecal or abattoir, if it's available. We also know that Gudair, if used in animals that have already been exposed to Johne's disease and are infected, will assist them mounting a bit of an immune response, and it will help them prolong their life. It will reduce the amount of bacteria they shed, but it won't take it down to nothing. And it certainly won't cure them. It has no curative effect. It's basically protection only. And as with a lot of vaccines, even if your method's spot on and you're doing it right, it's only 90% effective. So if you bring Johne's disease onto your property, vaccination alone is not going to eradicate it from your property. So it's important to note. And I think one of the messages that's important to get across tonight is that preventing Johne's getting onto your place and being aware of it and asking the right questions is far better than just relying on vaccine to fix a problem up for you that you've brought on inadvertently. And the other issue with Johne's, and that's why it's such a frustrating disease to deal with, is that by the time you know you have it, it's probably been there 5 to 10 years. So it's making good decisions now to prevent future problems. There's probably the most important point with regards to Johne's, probably more important than Gudair vaccine, is sourcing sheep with a negative OJD testing history. Ask questions about previous flock testing if it's not all detailed on the sheep health declaration, and ask about previous positive tests, or how many years worth of tests have occurred, how many abattoir tests have been received. The more negative testing, the greater your assurance that you're not going to inherit an issue. So the best test in terms of picking up disease is a pooled fecal culture. This is generally performed by a private vet. People who are on the market assurance program are well versed with the PFC test, and you basically sample 350 of the higher risk adult sheep across the flock in 7 pools of 50, and they try and grow the Lice bacteria out of those pools. That takes some time, but if they don't find anything, then you receive a negative PFC 350, which is, as I said, a pretty high level of assurance that that flock doesn't have Lice. There's also the option for abattoir 150 and 500 inspections. You sell caster age sheep to the abattoir, particularly TFI, you can request an inspection that doesn't cost you anything. But they're not just doing them automatically anymore, so you need to request that, and you can do that through your local animal health officer. As I said, it won't cost anything, and I think the fact that it doesn't cost anything would make it a good thing for people to take on board and request if they are sending sheep to that abattoir. I think that will help maintain some level of assurance that Lice isn't coming onto your place. Abattoir 500, though, certainly not as accurate or as definitive a test as the PFC 350. As I said, the longer the history of negative testing, the better the assurance that that flock's free of Lice. I talked about OJD being a slow developing disease and the fact that it lasts a very long time. Just reiterating that prevention in terms of preventing it getting onto your property is the best risk management solution, not trying to deal with it once it's there. Just want to talk a bit about the National Sheep Health Declaration. This is the new version which has only been released July this year. In relation to Lice and the testing that I'm talking about, there's a couple of questions which you want to interrogate when you are looking at these forms when sourcing sheep. So the first one there is whether they're from a sheep mat flock. And sheep mat flocks are those that have those MN 1, 2 and 3 statuses, and they've all done quite a lot of rigorous testing and auditing by a private vet to certify them to a high level of assurance that Lice is not on the place. The other question is question 9, where the vendor can declare what testing they've done if they're not on the map. So that'll either list in there whether it's an abattoir 150, 500, or a PFC, or the new high throughput PCR tests. That's the sort of information you'll read in those 2 questions. As I mentioned before, Sheep Health Declaration compulsory for all movement of sheep in South Australia. You must receive one if you're receiving sheep from an external source. And so if you have agents or anyone else sourcing sheep on your behalf, you need to make sure that they're passing these statements on to you. I put up this slide just to assist us with working out where we've detected Lice disease in South Australia through the course of the program. What we've found with Lice is that most detections in South Australia, and indeed across Australia, occur in the 400 plus mil average annual rainfall, and that's over 30 years, not over the past 2. It's been significantly drier. If you look at these areas of this medium sort of shading of green, they're your sort of 400 to 500 mil average areas. Southeast, Fleurieu, Kangaroo Island, up into the mid-north, bit of the York Peninsula and the Lower Eyre Peninsula. And that's pretty much where, in terms of detections of Lice in South Australia, that's where they've been. Not to say that the disease couldn't be present in other areas, but certainly once it gets into an area or a flock in an area, it proliferates itself much more readily where there's abundant moisture. And this slide is a very handy slide, and whilst it's a few years old, because the other states ceased their programs some time ago, this details the prevalence of Johne's disease across Australia. So now that it's easier to source sheep interstate, it's handy to know where the disease has been found interstate. So from 0 cases in the blue shading down through the spectrum of reds to black is where you've got 55+% of flocks infected with disease. So you can see where Johne's was first detected here in New South Wales. You've got more than half of the flocks are actually infected. Really important to note that if you're thinking of buying sheep in those areas, because your chances of picking it up are pretty high. What I think is pleasing from this this graphic, and it's not a PIRSA graphic, is that even in our areas where we know we've had significant amounts of disease, Kangaroo Island, southeast, sort of through the hills and the mid-north, we're still sitting at that 0 to 5% of infection. And that shows that the program was effective and that we're starting at a good base now for industry to take over and keep it at a low level. So message there is South Australian sheep are pretty safe to buy. We're moving on to foot rot, another bacterial disease that likes wet conditions. Just a bit of an intro on foot rot. We classify foot rot in South Australia as an inflammation of the interdigital skin and potential underrunning of the hoof caused by the bacteria Bacteria nodosus. It includes the full spectrum of D. nodosus, from the benign strains right through to the virulent ones. And foot rot has significant impacts on enterprise productivity, profitability, and in serious cases, certainly welfare. The key with foot rot is to detect it early and pick it up when it's at a low level and deal with it, get on with it, and eradicate it and move on. When it gets established in a flock, it causes the hooves to grow in a misshapen way, thus making itself a lovely habitat to live in right through dry periods and reinfect again through the spring. So picking it up early is the most advantageous way of getting rid of it and ensuring it doesn't establish itself in your flock. This is electron microscope slide of D. nodosus, the foot rot bacteria. What you'll notice here are these little filaments that extend out from each end of the bacteria. They would enable it to attach to pasture and dirt and hoof and cling to the hoof and cause infection. I'll talk a little bit later briefly about the vaccines. The monovalent vaccine that was developed 10 or 15 years ago relied on the antigens in what these are called, these little fibrae, to develop vaccines specific to the type of bacteria that was in an infection. The newer vaccines actually use surface antigens, which are all over the surface of that bacteria. I'll talk about that later. So when we talk about foot rot can be difficult to diagnose and often takes a fair bit of knowledge and pairing to diagnose it effectively. But in South Australia, when you have lame sheep, the first thing you see with foot rot is this hair loss and this wetness, and you can see there a little bit of running into the inside wall of the hoof, where that bacteria is actually digesting that hoof and seeking to lodge in underneath it and eat away between the connective tissue of the hoof. But if you tip a lame sheep over and you just look in between the claws, that's what you'll most commonly see, particularly in springtime, which is when it proliferates. And that, as you can see, enables things like grass seeds to get wedged in there because it's soft and moist, and they can easily get trapped in there and help basically keep the infection going. And in fact, that's actually a reasonably low-grade lesion of foot rot there. When you actually do a bit of pairing and you cut into the hoof, you can see that that infection has actually run up the inside of the hoof there, from that skin area right across the sole to the outside wall and around the toe here. So what it's actually doing is, think of it eating underneath your fingernail until your fingernails fall off. Sheep walk on their fingernails, so if that happens to them, they obviously become pretty severely lame. And this sort of lesion, if you just look at between the toes of a sheep, you're not going to see it. You've actually got to get in there with some pairers, somebody who knows what they're looking at, to expose that lesion. And it tends to progress from the interdigital area here, across the sole of the foot, around the heel to the outside wall, and then it will actually eat up the hoof towards the coronet or the hairline. And in severe cases, that whole shell of that hoof will almost fall off. And in some, get fly struck, and obviously not very good for sheep. So that is a score 5 lesion. That's as severe as foot rot gets. I just want to talk a little bit about virulent and benign foot rot, because I think in my career this seems to have caused producers the most confusion when dealing with foot rot diagnosis. There has been this expectation, I think, and possibly advisors and the like have fueled that there's virulent foot rot on one side and there's benign foot rot on the other, and in the middle there's a line, and we draw a line and we say, well, you've got benign, so you're all right, and if you've got virulent, you need to do something about it. Well, it's actually not like that in reality. You have some very severely virulent strains at this end, which you can end up with 75 to 90% of your flock with those lesions, like the last slide, and then you get to this end where you don't have much more than a bit of redness and loss of hair and sweatiness and some lameness in springtime. Unfortunately, there's a myriad of different strains in between, or degrees of severity in between, and it's often very difficult to work out where exactly an infection on a property lies. Because of that fact, and because in South Australia we have areas where it's not always wet enough for foot rot to get to the really bad form, we've actually gone from a change in the way we diagnose foot rot in South Australia. We used to do it on being called out to a property, having a look at a whole heap of sheep, working out how bad the lesions were and giving a diagnosis on that. And unfortunately, things can limit how severe lesions get. There'll be dry years when lesions will only progress to low grade, like the first slide, however have the capacity in wetter years to be much worse. So we've replaced that clinical diagnosis with laboratory diagnosis, and so now we classify it as to its potential severity, not necessarily what it looks like at a certain snapshot in time in a certain mob. And that's going to lead to a lot more accurate diagnosis and a lot better advice being able to be provided to people with regards to getting rid of it. The test that we found aligns most closely with our clinical diagnosis in South Australia is called the elastase test. I won't run into how it works, but you basically need to culture the bacteria and then run it through this elastase test, and you get a result in a number of days as to how quickly that particular bacteria can digest an enzyme that's present in the hoof. And the lower the score of days, the more virulent the cultured bacteria is. So it's scored in multiples of 4, 8, 12, 16, 20. So your 4-day is your virulent end of the spectrum, your 20 is your benign end of the spectrum. And provided we can get enough good samples, we'll be able to diagnose foot rot on farm using that test quite effectively. If we get bad scores, like score 4 and 5 lesions, like the second photo, we'll still be able to classify that as virulent foot rot. It's pretty obviously severe. The test is going to be more useful when we're not getting full expression due to climactic or sheep factors limiting the foot rot's potential in that particular period. When we pick up foot rot, all lesions are going to be classified as suspicious of virulent foot rot until we get those results that tell us if it is or if it isn't. And that's purely to protect people who may be buying sheep from that property, to prevent them buying virulent foot rot onto their property. As with OJD, we've removed automatic quarantines. We certainly find in South Australia that most people who are diagnosed with foot rot in their flock are very keen to do something about it. They don't want to pass it on to other people, and so giving them a piece of paper telling them what they're already going to do didn't seem to be the most effective use of our resource. So there won't be automatic quarantines. They'll be reserved for those that don't do the right thing and expose other people to infection. Trade of sheep infected with the less severe strains of foot rot will be permitted, but it will be on notification. So, you know, there's plenty of feedlots that will take lambs that have been exposed to foot rot, grow them out for slaughter at no risk to anyone else. And we see that as a reasonable thing to do for people who still need to trade sheep when they get an infection. However, they'll need to let the people purchasing them know that they've got it, and they'll need to declare it on the Sheep Health Declaration. So back to the Sheep Health Declaration, and again, this is the new one from July this year. There's a couple of questions that relate to foot rot. This one here, Section B, Question 3 is the same as the previous version of the Sheep Health Declaration, asking whether the sheep in the flock are free of virulent foot rot. And now the addition of Question 4, asking whether the sheep in the flock are free of benign foot rot also, or as it has commonly been referred to in the past, scald. So it's important to note that if you are diagnosed with a benign form of foot rot, it is still important to declare that when you sell sheep. So foot rot remains notifiable in South Australia, and we do still have the ability to impose quarantine orders if we want. If you suspect your sheep have foot rot, or sheep you observe may have foot rot, you must notify PIRSA or your district vet. Suspicion of disease basically constitutes observing lame sheep in spring. If you can't put that down to something that's not foot rot, you've got to be suspicious that it could be. And as I said earlier, the best thing to do is to get an early diagnosis, because early diagnosis means less work in eradication later in the year. Our inspectors will conduct spread period inspections to see how severe the foot rot is, and as I said, take samples for our laboratory diagnosis. We'll notify you of the potential of the foot rot that we culture on your property, and what your trading options will be, and those trading options become more restrictive the more severe the foot rot that's cultured on your property is, which is in line with not wanting to expose other flocks to severe disease. Importantly, we help you develop a management plan in conjunction with your chosen contractor or private vet. And foot rot is, it takes quite a lot of effort and knowledge in order to develop a management plan. And our staff have all had lots of experience dealing with properties with foot rot and can provide you with the best course of action to get rid of it. In terms of treatment options for foot rot, and just, I suppose, trying to think of new and novel things, ironically, the most successful recent eradication programs in South Australia have been those that use the conventional eradication program, which is basically manual work, inspecting sheep, paring their feet back, foot bathing them, and culling animals that have severe lesions or don't respond to treatment. Antibiotics we found are useful, particularly for studs, people with high value animals that they can't afford to cull, or where you have high levels of infection and you can't afford to cull a significant proportion of your flock. But it can be difficult to incorporate into a program because it does have the propensity to hide infection until the next spread period, and so you end up with a subsequent breakdown. So you can use antibiotics. You just need to make sure that those animals are re-inspected during a spread period to make sure that they don't break down again in future. We have used and trialled strain-specific vaccines in South Australia. They have been quite costly, and we've found that they're very good at curing severe lesions, but don't do much to the benign strains of foot rot. So most people want to get rid of all forms of foot rot from their property. The strain-specific vaccine certainly helped in reducing the impact on the flock, reducing the severity of the foot rot, but it doesn't do much to eradicate without employing a conventional program following the vaccination. I mentioned before, Sydney Uni are working on a multivalent vaccine for all strains of foot rot, which has had promising trial results. They've identified antigens or surface proteins on all strains of foot rot that are common, and they're just working out which ones of those they can use to develop a multivalent vaccine. And if they find one that works for all strains of foot rot, that will be a big boon for the sheep industry, because you won't have to go around and culture the specific foot rot that you've got to get a vaccine. You'll be able to use a one vaccine fits all approach, but that's not really near the commercial phase yet. What we have used more recently, which has certainly aided the manual management of foot rot, electronic foot rot shears like the ones they use in vineyards, which you can get with safety gloves so that you don't chop your fingers off. Grinders, similar to die grinders or a large industrial version of your dentist drill, is certainly aided with the grinding out of that inside wall where the bacteria lodges early in infection, and basically getting all that necrotic material and underrun hoof away, so that when you foot bathe, the bacteria actually gets exposed to the foot bath. So there are a couple of useful sort of tools that have been used in programs recently and have saved RSI from using manual shears. So enough on foot rot. We'll move briefly onto sheep lice, which is one of our third sort of endemic control program in South Australia for sheep. So just a quick bit of revision on the sheep lice. Bovicola ovis is responsible for the majority of lice infestations in Australian sheep. It's a pale yellow insect that's not very long, only 2 mil. They have a broad red to brown head and red to brown stripes across the body of the adults. And it's estimated the cost of a sheep lice infestation, excluding the treatment, is estimated to reduce fleece weight by up to 1 kilo, as well as lost body condition from animals rubbing on fences and not grazing and that sort of thing. And unlike cattle and goat lice, sheep lice aren't blood suckers. They feed on skin particles like dandruff, not blood. So therefore, drenching sheep with a parasitized insecticide type drench is not going to kill sheep lice. You've got to get something on the surface of the animal that will kill them. So these are some pictures of sheep lice, obviously blown up, but you've got the adults here. You can see the stripes on the body. There's a little egg on a fibre there and a couple of nymphs. They moult a couple of times to get to that stage when they can start to reproduce. So the complete life cycle of a lice is roughly a month, a bit more. Each female lays 10 to 20 eggs per month. So lice populations on a sheep can multiply 10 times a month, which in insects terms is not that high a reproductive rate. And it explains why often an infestation isn't noticed until well after it's actually first got into the flock. It can be a matter of months before you actually see signs of rubbing in a good proportion of sheep that makes you question what might have gone on. But the actual exposure to lice has often occurred months in advance of that. So the average lifespan of a female lice is 28 days. The males live a bit longer. They like cool temperatures, so 18 to 20 degrees. Above 45 will kill the eggs and females will stop laying. So the most favourable temperatures for survival are 36 to 37, which is on the skin. Interestingly, in South Australia, we find the most lice in the month that we're in, the month of August. Basically, it's cool enough that they're not getting too hot. They can get right down on the skin and keep warm. In general terms, the fleece of sheep is long at this time of year in the temperate areas, so there's good insulation, good habitat, and their numbers can build up because they've been some time since the last shearing and potential treatment. So we do find that August is our lice month in South Australia. So just a quick slide on the life cycle. So you have eggs that are attached to the wool fibre there. They hatch in 9 to 10 days. They moult a couple of times. You get adults that then mature. That's in the whole 34 days, and then they can start laying eggs again. So the whole life cycle is on the sheep. Important to note that sheep lice can only walk on fibres. They can't jump off the sheep and waddle across the paddock and jump up on another sheep. They move very slowly. They can only walk in the fleece. That's their habitat. Not unlike cat and dog fleas, they're not that mobile. So you've actually got to get sheep to sheep contact to get an infestation. So our control program in South Australia is underpinned by the livestock regulations. Suspicion of sheep lice is not notifiable. It used to be, but it's not now. So if you think you've got sheep lice, you don't have to run off to the department and let them know. But it is an offence to present lice-infested sheep at a public market. So be that a show, a sale yard, a field day, basically anywhere where there's more than one source of sheep is deemed to be a public market. And if sheep have lice at a public market, that's an offence, and you could receive a fine for that or a prosecution. The second offence, and these are the only offences under the livestock regs for lice, is that it's an offence to allow them to stray onto other properties or public roads. Our officers inspect all major sheep markets in South Australia, as well as shows and field days. And we also investigate reports of stray sheep and provide inspectorial services for lice, another notifiable disease where animals come onto your property and potentially expose your flock to nasties. So just looking at the detections we've had for lice in the last financial year, because this demonstrates the trend currently, you can see there that our merino sheep only account for 17% of our detections. That's obviously breeders where wool is of significant value, and so they're observing sheep and treating when appropriate. Crossbreds, 29%, but the blue sector here is what's really changed over the last sort of 3 or 4 years, in that the majority of our detections are occurring in the wool shedding breeds. Those breeds that either don't shear or treat or don't really notice the lice, because those breeds often rub anyway, and there's no value in the fleece, so they're not losing that value of the fleece. Where it is important is that these animals are reserved for lice populations can then reinfest the wool breeds of sheep, which is something that we're a bit concerned about. If we look across the state, we obviously get lice detections from all regions of South Australia where there are sheep. So there's no region that hasn't had a detection in the last financial year. However, the majority have been in the Adelaide Hills and the Fleurieu, smaller flocks and flocks that tend to go through sale yards rather than direct, where we get a good look at them. So these are the sorts of animals that we're picking up with lice, and a lot of them don't have an extreme rub, but you can certainly see where they have been rubbing, and yeah, they're quite common to find lice in these animals when we observe them at yards. So your current treatment options remain pretty static at the moment. There's no known resistance to the most commonly utilised backliner products, so your sminosins, your neonicotinoids and your ivermectins. They're the actives in your most common backliners that you'd all be familiar with, and there's still organophosphates on the market. what we need to be wary of is that resistance could be just around the corner. The problem with having really effective backliner treatments is that people keep using them, and some people tend to just keep using the same product because it's working for them. Unfortunately, with insects, that tends to select for resistance, and so you end up with selecting for populations of lice that are resistant to a chemical, which then build up, and unless you rotate to something else, you can no longer use that product. And all manufacturers of lice treatments in Australia would rather you didn't just constantly use their product over and over again, because they want that product to last for a long time. So you need to be rotating. Rotating means both the chemical you're using and the application method. So you can rotate from one backliner to another. You're probably best to throw in a plunge dip, like a saturation treatment or something in there at some point if you're having issues with lice from year to year. You are unlikely to eradicate lice from wool shedding sheep using backliner products. Two reasons. One, some of these animals aren't full shedders, so there's basically treating them as a long wool animal if you're not shearing them off. And they also don't have a lot of lanolin, so lanolin's what spreads the product out and gets it to where the lice are to kill them. To gain good control in wool shedding sheep, you still need to shear them, especially those that don't fully shed, and then treat them immediately thereafter, just like a wooled animal. We still recommend the occasional saturation treatment for eradicating lice. That's where you're plunge dipping, or some people still got the old shower dips. Smaller flocks might use some hand jetting. Well, that's where you're getting high volume of chemical to the whole body of the animal, so the lice have got nowhere to hide, and you'll get good results with that, particularly a few weeks off shears. There is a new product on the market this year. It's the first combo backliner. We've had combo drenches for worms around for a long time, where you combine one or two actives, so that if there is a resistance issue, the second active knocks that proportion of the population over. We haven't had any of these treatments for lice previously, so there's one out there now that combines two of those actives that I mentioned before, and so potentially that will come into its own if we start to experience resistance, which tends to go in sort of 5 to 10 year cycles in terms of product life. Just to demonstrate a couple of the treatment methods. Obviously, this is backlining. You can see the majority of these pole to tail, not missing too much of the animal there, and the standard double backline that they recommend now, so that if you waver a little bit, you're not missing one side of the animal. And portable plunge tip here, where they swim around in a solution of lice treatment chemical, get dunked a couple of times and saturated in an effort to kill all the lice. So if you want more information on tonight's talk, that's our website, Life Security Animal Health. All the information on our programs is there, as well as contacts for your local animal health staff. I think I've got a couple more there. If you're interested to read a bit more on the multivalent Footrot vaccine, there's a good article in Sheep Central from last year where they go into some detail explaining how they made that vaccine. It's very similar to the meningococcal B vaccine, using technology called reverse vaccination technology. You can read up on that at Sheep Central. And LiceBoss, a brilliant tool for anybody who's experiencing issues with lice or trying to work out what to do. Has all the treatments listed there in terms of dollars per head, what works, what doesn't, different methods you can employ. I highly recommend having a look at that if you want to know more about lice. If you want to have a say about any of the programs that I've talked about tonight, they're all industry funded programs. And so it's your industry that decides what happens with them and where money gets spent. So speak to Livestock SA or SASAG, or contact our head office for animal health at Glenside there. Thank you very much for listening tonight.
All right, thanks very much, Chris. We've got a couple of questions that have come in. So the first one is around OJD. And the question is it worth studs getting monitored negative status for OJD or go with fecal tests?
Well, they could do either. The monitored negative status, which is under the MAP program, requires fecal testing on a biannual basis, but it also has a post-mortem and veterinary audit component to it. So I suggest that the answer there would lie in how much you want to pay for your status. I personally think a PSC 350 every couple of years is a high level of assurance that you don't have an issue there, and may cost you less than subscribing to the MAP. But the MAP has other auditing protocols that probably add a higher level of assurance than just the PSC 350. Comes down to cost, I'd suggest, Ian.
All right, thanks, Chris. Just a observation from someone. Queensland was not included in your graphic of where OJD is. Is there no OJD in Queensland, or just a low number of sheep numbers?
Well, no, they still have sheep in the south, but their claims through the running of the national program was that they never detected a case of yonis. Understand the question, because if you look at the map, some of the shires in New South Wales that run along the border certainly did have disease. So that's about as much as I can comment on another state's program.
Yep, no, that's okay. If anyone's got some other questions, just quickly type them into the Q&A box, and we'll pass them on to Chris. One other question was around the lice side of things. Apart from inspecting sheep, are there any in-shed tests currently available or coming?
Yeah, there was one. There used to be one that again Sydney Uni developed, which was a PCR-based test, which was like a DNA test, which involved swabbing combs and cutters off shears, and a couple of organisations, including people who work out of the Roseworthy Uni on the Sheep Blueprint program, were looking at some of this portable PCR testing technology to run similar tests, and I believe they've developed that, but not to a commercial level yet. So PCR testing is very interesting, and you know, there's a lot of potential in it, because you can take these little units along and plug them in the shearing shed and run a couple of samples through in pretty short time and get a result, and it will pick up lice at a very low level, because it's basically just looking for a DNA sequence that's in the genome of a sheep lice. So yes, there's certainly quite a bit of work going on in that space, but nothing commercially available yet, as far as I'm aware.
Okay. One other was around plunge tips. I believe there's a number of companies with portable plunge tips. Are they listed anywhere? Apart from the telephone book, is there a sort of list on? There's a website at all of available?
There are
contractors.
Yeah, there's a contractors association website, which they'll be listed on if they're part of that association. Other than that, no, but I certainly do have details of most of the ones in South Australia, so people can contact me if they want to find out where their local one is. There's both the portable sort of plunge, like I showed in the picture, as well as the cage dipping contractors that go around that still registered to use diazinon. So they certainly have their own website as well.
Okay. Yeah, I don't believe there are any more questions at this stage, Chris. So I'd just like to thank everyone who joined us tonight for Animal Health Update webinar. And Chris, thank you very much for sharing your insights and expertise. If anyone has any additional questions or would like to connect directly with the Sheep Connect SA team, just contact us via the website or contact details on the website. I'd like to thank everybody for your time and have a great evening. Bye for now.